Welcome to this Easy 11 Plus short lesson on dealing with alliteration in written comprehension exercises. Please subscribe to my channel, please check out the links in the video description including various freebies, and let's get started with the lesson. So let's begin by talking a little about alliteration. What is it? Well, alliteration is an effect created when consonant sounds are repeated near to each other for a particular effect. It's really as simple as that. So for example, the kicking king is a clear example of alliteration. The kicking cat is also alliteration because although kicking begins with K and cat begins with C, they have the same consonant sound. The accidental apple is not alliteration because there we're dealing with a vowel sound. Sometimes consonants are technically alliterative, but they aren't really creating an effect of alliteration. They aren't doing anything. So for example, I looked at the yellow raincoat and the red raincoat, and I chose the red one. Red raincoat, it's not really alliterating, there's no particular effect there, the raincoat just happens to be red. So you need to make sure that when you identify alliteration, that it's in a situation where there's enough to say about it. And that's likely to mean two key things, and this is really important. So first of all, the alliteration is likely to suggest something about what's happening in the story or description that you're reading. So for instance, in the alliterative phrase, the pattering raindrops pottered across the roof, the p sound sounds a bit like the p of raindrops on the roof. So it helps you to imagine the sound of what's happening. You should also think about whether an alliteration has a particular emotional effect on the reader. So for example, the rhinoceros rammed herself relentlessly against my car. Yes, the repeated R sounds match the repeated ramming of the rhino's body, but they also create a sense of being pounded against, of being trapped, of there being something happening to you that keeps happening and that you can't control. So you could say that that alliteration is also quite intimidating. We can see that the question asks us to find two examples of alliteration in the passage that's provided, and we have to explain how each one is effective. And there are 6 marks available in total, and therefore it's reasonable to guess that there are 3 marks available for each part of our answer. And thinking about this, it suggests that there'll be 1 mark for identifying a clear example of alliteration, and 2 marks for talking about it. And because there are 2 marks for talking about it, we need to make sure that there's enough for us to say, that we don't just make 1 point with no extension. Either we make a point and then develop it in a way that's interesting and add something new, or we make 2 short points about the alliteration. Either of those should be fine to get 3 marks for part 1 and then 3 marks for part 2. Now let's look at the text. I can't display all of this on the screen in a way that allows you to read it easily, so I strongly recommend, if you haven't already, that you go to the worksheet linked in the video description and that you download it, print it off if possible, and have a read for yourself. And then, ideally, have a go at the questions before you watch the rest of this video. I'm not going to read through all of this with you because that would take a long time. One thing you're likely to notice is that this mongoose's name is Ricky Ticky, and that he makes a war cry, which goes Rick Tick Ticky Tick. And of course, there's lots of alliteration within his name, and particularly within the sound that he makes, from which his name is taken. However, it would be difficult to talk about that as an alliterative effect that's doing something particular here. To save time, I'm just going to underline the clearest examples of alliteration here that we might choose to discuss. One is bottle brush in line 4, another is carried him kicking and clucking in line 7, and another is fluffed up his fur in line 32. We need to talk about 2 of these, and in order to choose the best ones, you need to choose those that will comfortably allow you to get the marks by offering you enough to say. Although bottle brushes aren't common household items these days because we tend to chuck our bottles out rather than reusing them, you can imagine what it would be. It would be a brush to go up inside a bottle and clean it out like that. So you can imagine it would be stiff, wiry, but with lots of fluffiness all around it. That, of course, isn't a comment on the alliteration. Because, and this is very important, what you must not do is say, these words alliterate, and then just talk about in general what they mean. You have to talk about the alliterative sound and the effect that this has. That's an incredibly common error in written comprehension when talking about alliteration. You have to talk about the alliteration itself, not just about the words that the alliteration appears in. So what does the BB sound here suggest? He could fluff up his tail till it looked like a bottle brush. Bah, bah. Well, it's quite a bold, strong sound. It suggests that the tail is very confidently held, and it suggests Rikki Tikki's pride as he stands there with his fluffy tail vertical behind him. So I think there's likely to be plenty there for us to say for our 3 marks. What about carried him kicking and clucking? Let's look at the sentence. One day a high summer flood washed him out of the burrow where he lived with his father and mother and carried him kicking and clucking down a roadside ditch. Well, we can really imagine the clucking sound that he makes being reflected in these letters. Carried him kicking and clucking as he objects indignantly to being swept away by this water. And perhaps the k also reflects the bumpiness as he's swept along and bashed against things as he goes. So I think there's loads to say about this one as well. Having already found 2 options here that give us plenty to discuss, we don't need to waste time in our exam considering the third one. Let's just go straight in and discuss these 2. So the first one is bottle brush. Don't forget to show off the quotation that you found by quoting it, and don't forget to use quotation marks when you provide a quotation. However, it's not a good idea to do this. By writing bottle brush is my first example of alliteration, I've used up a sentence and a considerable amount of space and time just saying something that's obvious. If I quote that phrase in a sentence and talk about it as alliteration, then obviously it is my first example of alliteration. You don't need to say so. So I begin by launching in straight with the sound. Bottle brush creates a bold, confident mood by repeating a B sound. If you're used to the way that I mark other people's writing, you might say that bold and confident are essentially saying the same thing, and there really isn't any need to have those 2 words. But I think that I reinforce the point quite clearly by including them, so I'm going to leave it like that. The firm sound matches the firmness of the mongoose's tail, so I very clearly linked the sound to what the sound is representing in the story by using a word like matches to show the match that I'm creating. Now let's go back to what we were talking about when we looked at the text, about how this suggests Rikki Tikki's pride and his confident pride in it. Now another thing that you might notice from the way that I often mark other people's writing is that I dislike repeated words, and you'll notice that I've repeated the word confident. Here I've actually done that deliberately, for all that stylistically it might be a little bit messy, because I want to show really clearly that I'm linking the confident mood in my first sentence created by the sound to Rikki Tikki's confident pride. And I'm showing that the mood created in the reader by this alliteration helps us to imagine the feelings that Rikki Tikki, a character in the story, experiences. So here's the whole answer. Bottle brush creates a bold, confident mood by repeating a B sound. The firm sound matches the firmness of the mongoose's tail and his confident pride in it. And that's certainly going to be comfortably adequate for 3 marks here. A few things to draw your attention to here. One is that, as I discussed earlier on, I'm drawing connections to literal ideas. In other words, it's a firm sound and the tail is itself very firm, but I'm also linking it to emotional ideas, confidence, boldness, pride. Another thing you might notice is that I've made strong use of adjectives here: bold, confident, firm. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that a good comprehension answer is full of squizillions of adjectives, absolutely not. But this does show part of the thought process here, that I've thought carefully about what ideas, what emotional ideas, what adjectives might belong with this alliteration of B. I thought that it suggests boldness, confidence, firmness, and then I've linked those ideas to my understanding of the text. And so the adjectives actually provide a kind of mental structure to how I approach putting together this answer. Carried him kicking and clucking is, if anything, a little easier, I think, because as we saw, there's so much to say about it. And quite straightforwardly, we were talking about his sound as he goes along and the bumping on the banks as he goes down this ditch. So in fact, in this case, there's plenty for us to say on a literal level about what these sounds suggest about what's actually happening in the story without us needing to go so much into emotional ideas. Notice how, once again, I'm not writing carried him kicking and clucking is my second example. I'm just getting straight in to making my point. The fact that I've quoted it and I'm talking about it as an alliteration, is more than enough to get that mark for identifying an example. You'll notice that I've included a stray and meaningless quotation mark here. Any of us can make mistakes. The important thing is to spot them and correct them, like this. Let's go on. Carried him, kicking and clucking, makes me imagine Rikki Tikki's hard, repeated and desperate sounds when he is scared. Again, notice how I've found various adjectives that match the mood and the situation, and I've used those to create a very clear link to this alliterative quotation. It's still worth making clear that we're talking about a C or K sound. So let's do this in the next sentence as we talk about the bumping that we discussed before. The C/K sounds might also suggest his body clunking into things as he is swept along. Now I could have said banging or bashing into things or knocking into things, but I thought it was good to use a verb that also begins with a K sound in order to make absolutely clear what I think the alliteration is doing. You'll notice that these two answers are rather different. The first answer essentially develops a single point. It talks about the bold, confident mood created by the B sounds, and it explains in a bit more detail what this confidence and boldness may suggest about the tale and about Rikki Tikki. The other thing about this first answer is that it's focused on literal effects and on emotional ideas. The second answer makes two separate points. One is about the sound that Rikki Tikki makes, and the other is about his body being clonked against things as he goes, which is just a guess, but it's a very reasonable guess based on this quotation. And you'll notice that I've included the phrase might also suggest in the second sentence to make clear that this is an educated guess. It isn't something that's proved by the text. And this second answer is just focused on literal ideas, on things that actually happen or might happen in the text. The sound that Rikki makes, what happens to his body. We're not talking about emotions here, the question doesn't require us to, and there's plenty for us to say here to get the 3 marks more than comfortably. So there are many different approaches. Whatever approach you take, you just need to do it well. And the last thing I want to point out that I said earlier, but it's so important, is that in these answers I have relentlessly talked about the alliteration. So I haven't said bottle brush suggests the shape of Rikki Tikki's tail, because a bottle brush would be something wiry and fluffy that you put up inside a bottle to clean it out, and his tail looks like that. That would have nothing to do with the alliterative sound, which is all that you're supposed to be talking about here. Similarly, when I talk about carried him kicking and clucking, I only talk about the effects created by the repeated k sound. That's all I'm dealing with, and I don't let myself get distracted by anything else. That's really difficult. It's at the hardest end of what you might be required to do in an 11+ exam, but nevertheless, it might happen, so it's well worth practicing. Please subscribe to my channel, check out the links in the video description, and perhaps sign up for the free resources with full example answers and explanations that you can find there. And I hope to see you next Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock for my next Easy 11+ live lesson. Bye bye.